Welcome, Jess Philips, Nick Boles, two of Parliament's shrinking violets, and we're so incredibly pleased to have lured you out to a microphone. It's very good to see you both. It's been an extraordinary week. That's a template, like out of office, that we use now. Has anything changed, Nick?
Well, it's quite interesting, actually, because on my way in here, I bumped into a colleague who will remain nameless, but who's a very senior friend of Theresa May's. And
gosh, that narrows it.
Yes. And I said, not much changed, has it really? And he said, well, it could be worse. And that means that it's one of the best days for a long time.
He said nothing had changed.
He said basically that nothing had changed. We then actually went into it a little bit more, and what we've agreed that the one thing that had changed was that the prospect of a no-deal Brexit was now even less than it had been the day before yesterday, because it was now clear that there was not going to be a new Prime Minister who was more open to the idea of a no-deal Brexit. And also it was clear from what Theresa May had said in the 1922 committee that she was very, very unkeen on a no-deal Brexit. And also, bluntly, that the people who voted for her won't wear a no-deal Brexit, and most of the people who might wear a no-deal Brexit voted against her. So I think that Theresa May will sort of know where her troops are.
You're nodding, Jess.
Yeah, no, I think that is about right as far as the Tory party is concerned. To me, it feels a little bit like every week that nothing changes, and I do feel like Theresa May is living out some sort of soap opera, which I have called Nothing Has Changed. She makes the same speech every 5 minutes, and we all sit around the TV waiting for the podium. Has it got the sign on? Hasn't it got the sign on? Everybody's waiting. You're not leaving work because you think, oh, well, something might happen while I'm on the journey home, and then nothing changes, and the same speech occurs, and she just talks about housing and homelessness and, building the economy and how we've got to get on with it. But so in the Tory party, I hope that the rabbit hole that they fall down, the sort of hard Brexiteers, a line can be drawn under it now. For the country, though, another week gone by where nothing has happened, to me, gets us a week closer to a no deal, an accidental no deal, I suppose. And so I think we're on a bit of a high wire because this week has been wasted largely.
Yeah. You're not sure that risk has gone away of no deal, even though you might have someone in the driving seat who's clearly not a big fan of it for all the talk of no deals. Better than a bad deal.
Yeah, well, she would have to pull some sort of rabbit out of a hat if it gets too long and we don't have something in place.
Or delay.
She was quite explicit. It's interesting, and I'm not sure whether this has been reported, but she was quite explicit in talking through how even a no-deal Brexit would require legislation. And that it was... She suggested, very hard to see where a majority for that legislation would come from. And that she also made reference to the fact that if Parliament had expressed a very strong opinion, either in favour of something or against something like no deal, that the courts would take that very seriously and that this all could end up in courts.
She spelled that out.
I think it was then, and I'm now trying to remember whether I'm misremembering the conversation.
Yes.
But
that was in the 22 committee when she was talking to backbench Tory MPs.
I think it was probably an answer to question, but it was basically this idea that if we don't... her whole pitch to the party was, if we don't come together and get something over the line... don't think that you can predict exactly what will happen. And the message, I think, obviously to those who were most inclined not to support her, was don't think that we somehow automatically drive off the cliff into a no-deal Brexit, even though technically that's what the Article 50 legislation would appear to suggest. What I think she was trying to educate us all about is the fact that even that requires legislation, requires some bills to go through Parliament.
And the only thing that does have a majority actually in Parliament is against a no deal. That would get a majority vote in Parliament, regardless of how anyone was whipped. There is over 400 MPs, I'd say, who would never allow a no deal.
Everybody knows what they don't want.
It's classic politics, that is.
Well, I've never known it quite like this.
No, it is pretty bad.
Well, it was the House of Lords reform all those years ago wasn't dissimilar. Was everybody knew that they didn't want the House of Lords in its current form,
this was
but
a whole
nobody wanted any specific alternative.
Right. I was going to come to this. This is a multiple choice question that was put in front of the members of Parliament. Best way to sort this out, the clever brains at Number 10 thought back in Tony Blair's day, was nobody quite knew what balance you should have, elected or unelected, in the House of Lords. So let's just put the percentages there and let everybody vote. And it was a car crash.
Absolute car crash.
And what certain cabinet ministers, I think one might consider them allies of yours, some of them, Nick, are suggesting is that we have some polling, as it were, in the House of Commons to try and find out if there's a majority around any of the options. Indicative voting, indicative polls in the House of Commons. Would that work? Where would it go?
Do you know what? I don't actually think it's necessarily a bad idea at the moment, because one of the things I would say throughout this process is there has not been anywhere near enough testing on the House. And actually, the House is the reason that she's falling. She cannot get her deal through the House of Commons. And, I mean, I think that Theresa May would likely have got her deals through the House of Commons, for example, if we had a secret ballot. I think that that's probably true. And so in that, I think that there is a need to do some indicative polling of what can get through. I just wish it had happened a year ago and that it had formed part of the negotiations, that what might eventually get through, and it had felt like everybody's deal. I'm not here to talk about a government of national unity. I am here to talk about a national issue that I think could have been handled much better in a cross-party way.
No, I completely agree with that. I think a process of national unity is what we should have had. We frankly should have done it straight after the referendum,
Absolutely.
But we certainly should have done it once we lost our majority. And the biggest missed opportunity of Theresa May's premiership is not recognising that that's what that election result meant, and that she could
let alone the narrow referendum result.
Let alone the narrow referendum result. But once you'd had one overlain on the top of the other, it was just blindingly obvious, I think, that was a moment to say we've all got to sit down. And not to say it would have been easy, and of course different parties would have played political games with it. Of course, all of normal politics would have happened. But if
that would be nice. I don't think I've seen that for a while.
But if it had been fundamentally this idea that we are going to hammer out something together that we can all live with, or that at least 400 of us can live with, then I think we'd be in a very different place. And you could have kept that, as it were, issue coalition, Brexit coalition, together for the purposes not just of the meaningful vote, but also for the implementation bill that needs to follow. But, gone back to knocking 5 bills out of each other on every single other issue. And as soon as Brexit was, as it were, put to bed, then returned to normal politics.
I agree totally. And actually, it's what happens on committees in the House of Commons, is that people on issues across party, that you hammer out recommendations for the government, and you hammer the government when they don't do those recommendations. And then I sit across from people who I sit on committee with and I'm totally able to talk through issues with, and I will hammer 10 bells out of them for voting for universal credit or whatever it is this week. And I think actually our parliamentary democracy was good enough to do that. The trouble is that the snap general election is part of the problem, and it emboldened the front bench of my party to basically say no to doing any sort of coalition building around this issue.
But do you remember the David Cameron after the 2010 election, and that straight out of the traps the next morning, I'm going to make a big comprehensive offer, what he called it,
big generous
to the
offer.
to the Liberal Democrats. Imagine if, somewhat humbled by the result, but imagine if Theresa May had done that the day after the June 17 election, and said, I've listened to what the people have said, and this is what they're telling me, and I'm making this big offer to all opposition parties, not just Jeremy Corbyn, but to Nicola Sturgeon, to Plaid Cymru, to Liberal Democrats, to the DUP. I think we could be in a very different place right now.
Yeah.
The trouble is we're now sort of being forced into doing it
Very late.
incredibly late.
After lots of ill will.
Exactly.
But what would be on the indicative vote menu if we were to get there? If it is a wise thing to do, maybe it's one of the few options left. I don't know.
I'm a bit nervous about it, though I like in a sense, I like the thinking behind it. I'm a bit nervous about how it would play out, a bit like this Lord's reform.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that I completely understand, and I think this is particularly true in the Labour Party, but it's also true in other opposition parties, in the SNP and Plaid Cymru, in the Liberal Democrats. There are lots of people whose first preference would be to have a second referendum, but who, if that were to prove impossible or unavailable, would then, I think, be open to persuasion to back a soft Brexit of the kind I've been recommending in the Norway Plus.
Which means, just so people realise, staying in the single market?
Staying in the single market, staying in a customs union at least until there's a new arrangement, but being outside the European Union and outside the European Court and various other things.
But you do have to take freedom of movement, which was one of the things Theresa May was trying to avoid.
Exactly. You have to accept all of the full freedoms with some extra qualifications, but still basically fundamentally the same pitch.
There are things we could be doing as national lawmakers around some of the immigration concerns that we don't.
I want to come back to that, the whole immigration heading. But if that's on the menu in an indicative vote,
my worry is that even if it was said you can vote for as many as you like, and you can vote for your first preference and your second preference and your third preference, it's not always naturally how we behave. We're not used to that. It's not the way our system works. And there's always going to be a natural tendency, and you've seen it in recent days and weeks to an extent with the way that the second referendum campaign has tried to effectively destroy the Norway Plus option, even though it's the soft Brexit that many of them would favour if they were forced to adopt a Brexit.
They'd have bitten your hand off for it a few months ago.
Exactly. and it's because in our system, the way you win is not just by promoting your idea, but it's by smashing the other ideas. And my nervousness is that if you bring a sort of smorgasbord too early to people, that people will pick their favourite and then go around voting against all of the things that aren't their favourite, even though they might be things they could live with. Because my belief is that all of us are going to end up having to live with something we don't love.
I think that is totally right.
Presumably
it's about timing. I want a second referendum.
And that would be on the smorgasbord.
That would be on the smorgasbord,
under this approach. And how do you think it would actually do?
What, a second referendum?
In the House of Commons amongst
At
MPs?
the moment, unless the Labour Party
how
whips for a people's vote, it doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons. If the Labour Party whips for a people's vote, it would have a majority in the House of Commons.
And what do you think are the chances of the leadership of your party?
I think it gets more likely every day.
On a percentage right now, if you were to call it?
Oh, on a percentage, I'm going to say 60-40.
Okay.
To be done by mid-January.
Right.
I mean, I went from vague to being quite specific there. I'm not sure why I felt the need to make that specific prediction.
We like that in answers. You have to sleep, though.
I think you're right. I think it is growing in probability.
It is growing.
The only thing I'm not totally sure is basically what it depends. Jess is right that it requires Jeremy Corbyn to back it.
Mm-hmm, it does.
But I'm not sure whether that in itself is a slam dunk. As in, there will be somewhere between 10 and, I think, maximum 30 Conservative MPs who might vote for it. The question is how many Labour MPs, even if Jeremy Corbyn has backed it, wouldn't support it.
You have these conversations,
and I think
Jess,
that broadly, whichever one is bigger is the one that determines the result. So if there are more Tories voting for it than Labour voting against it, then it probably gets through.
There's a lot of Labour MPs who are very, very nervous about the idea of a second referendum.
Yes, there are. Absolutely, there are a lot, but they're...
Not nervous, hostile, a lot of them.
I mean, there are some that are hostile. It just depends how much they are more worried about what their Labour membership think or what their electorate think, because actually a whip by Jeremy Corbyn for a lot of my colleagues actually just takes the pressure off them. It's just like, oh, do you know what, I'm following the whip, and that's why we have whips. True. Actually, that is why we have whips.
Yes, to make it easier to do things you don't much like.
I think it is. There are things in the balance, the number in the balance, as you say. I would say at the moment, I don't know so much about the Tories who would vote for it, people's vote. The ones that have come out, I would say in the balance would equal each other out currently with Labour MPs.
So it'd be tight.
So it'd be tight. That's not a reason not to try and push for it. That's the whole theatre of our parliamentary politics. But I think that I would want to see that option eliminated before then having to consider. And
I pinned my colours to a mast. I prefer and am advocating the Norway Plus option, but I am very keen that anybody who wants to support a second referendum, I don't support, I wouldn't vote for it, but anybody who does, in a sense, has had their chance to do so before putting to them Norway Plus, because I think that a second referendum can, for some people, sound like, oh, great, let's just put the decision back to the people.
Yeah.
But when you get into the technical details of it, it actually becomes incredibly hard to see how it actually happens. You need a government to propose a bill. At the moment, more or less, we have a Conservative government. The Conservative government that put forward a referendum bill, would fall by tea time. Because, there are enough Conservative MPs who are implacably opposed to it that, it doesn't matter how many confidence motions and how many months until the next one, they would find a way of bringing down a government that was bringing forward that bill. So it actually, in my view, probably requires a Labour government. So therefore an election first to get a Labour government.
It's a bit time-consuming now. This.
So that's why I think that, in a sense, it needs to have had its moment. I think these things need to be sequential. There needs to have been a proper go. If Jeremy Corbyn is going to decide to back it, there needs to have been a proper go at seeing if Parliament will support it. And if, as I anticipate, actually it doesn't quite come off, then I think many of the people who, like Jess, who support it, might then support.
Might you swing around? If it had blown its opportunity, couldn't get the numbers, you might back Nick's idea.
I am not an ideologue in this situation. I only came out to support People's Vote a number of weeks ago, and I did it because what I saw was an enormous failing of Parliament to take this decision. And it was that pushed me, as well as my constituents, I have to say, shifted. There has been a definite shift in the conversations and also the lobbying, and there's just a different feeling in my constituency, and that drives me. But in reality, I didn't go there out of some sort of die-hard Remainiac sense of duty. I do want to stay in the European Union, as I know most of my colleagues do, but that isn't what drives me to the position of wanting a People's Vote now. I think we are at deadlock, and actually, I genuinely trust the people where I live to make the decisions about their lives in a moment when we can't. I really do trust them, and I really trust my electorate. And I think that a lot of the conversations that are sort of the anti-People's Vote conversations are really, really patronising towards people who live in places like where I live, and that hardens my heart even more to let them decide a little bit. But I didn't come here through sort of ideology, and if that option of remaining or having a very soft deal didn't come from them, I and I didn't get the option to have that, I'm not going to play kamikaze with the country. I'm never going to do that. Even I would stake my career, I would stake my seat if I thought that a no-deal Brexit was going to happen, and I would vote for something softer, for a soft Brexit. I won't let no deal happen, even if I go against the Labour whip, even if I get deselected. It doesn't. None of that matters to me, actually.
What would that referendum be like? There have been some very stark pictures painted of real violence, division. It wouldn't be healing. It would actually split us up even more than we are split up at the moment as a country. Is that accurate? Could it be done better? Is that destiny? What do you think?
No, I don't think it is destiny. I have to say, I am getting a little bit tired of posh people telling me what it's like in my community to talk about Brexit. I live in a Leave seat with a massive white working class community and a massive BME working class community who people immediately forget the BME working class in all these conversations, and quite a lot of them voted Leave as well. So there needs to be have a conversation about how we win over all the votes. I think I'm getting a little bit tired of people trying to suggest to me that I am fueling Tommy Robinson. It is not acceptable to say that. And also, if people think that I shouldn't control my desires for the country based on what Tommy Robinson might do, even that I might even suffer violence myself has been laid at my door. Don't you remember what happened last time? How would you know that you'd be safe? If there is anything that's going to make me stand up and fight back, it is people saying that my liberty is being controlled by a threat from the far right. I just don't recognise it on the streets where I live. There are very, very Leave people in my constituency who campaigned with Priti Patel, who campaigned in the Leave, who have been in to see me over the last few weeks. And when I say, well, I'm going to back a people's vote, they're like, all right, Bab, well, we just disagree. The idea that people are savages and are going to act with savagery, there will be some people frothing up violence in those communities, no doubt about it. I don't think they're anywhere near as powerful as we all gave them credit for, and we shouldn't fall down that rabbit hole. We should carry on doing what we think, with our liberal values, is the right thing to do.
Nick?
I mean, I always listen to Jess, and I'm influenced by what she says, and I'm sure she's right that 99% of the population could cope perfectly well with being asked again, and thinking about it and coming to a conclusion, and maybe coming to a different conclusion than the person they share a bed with every night, and still, being able to get up next morning and get the kids to school or whatever it is. So I'm sure she's absolutely right about that. The two fears that I have about it are, firstly, that it wouldn't end there. That, or at least the only way it would end there would be if the Leave option, however that was framed, won again. Mm-hmm. And of course, the main motive of most of the people supporting a second referendum, I'm not saying all, but most of them, is that they actually believe that they can reverse the result, that Remain will win this time. And if Remain does win this time, 2 years after having a clear referendum vote, which we all promised to deliver, saying Leave, the campaign for a third referendum will start literally the next morning. And I worry that this country will never break out of this endless sort of incredibly dysfunctional never-ending. Yeah. So that's my first concern. Yeah, and my second concern is that while I think that there isn't this sort of bubbling potential extremist force sort of in all of our communities just waiting for somebody to light a blue touch paper, but what there is the potential for a party like UKIP, like UKIP was, to start up again, with probably slightly more vivid language, because they would claim betrayal if the referendum had overturned the result of the previous one, and to make very, very substantial inroads into really both major parties. And while at one level you might say, well, that's democracy, and if that's what people think and what they want, they have an entitled to have a vehicle to vote for it. I'm afraid I'm not that much of a Democrat. I actually believe our parliamentary democracy is stronger because we have two big parties that are quite broad coalitions that are able to blunt the sort of hard edges of more extreme politics, both on the left and on the right.
I think that's right.
And that would be my concern. And of course, it would probably have a more damaging effect on the Conservative Party than on the Labour Party. But I don't think it would exclusively for us. I think there are lots of those northeastern seats that voted heavily to leave. So those are the two main reservations I have about it. But ultimately, if Parliament simply cannot decide on anything else, I'm busily trying to provide them with something else that I hope that they will come behind. But if actually we're on the 20th of March and Brexit is in 9 days' time and we still haven't voted for anything, then it's quite hard to see what else do we do.
Yeah.
But for me, it would be a very, very bitter pill to swallow.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that. I think that there's lots to worry about in a second referendum. It won't be easy, and it would need to be framed very well, and it would need to be framed by the people, in my opinion. I think that all sorts of things need to be considered about how we lead into it, and maybe there isn't time and all that. I'm just not willing to sort of play out the sort of barbarians versus the elites.
Where has feeling on immigration gone since that referendum? And how much of a driver for you was it, do you think, in your seat, was it for those that opted for leave? This week coming could be the week we get the immigration white paper.
She said that we'll get something.
Then someone in the Home Office told me not. Which is not an unusual course.
I was going to say we were meant to have something this week. I can't remember what it was.
Let's imagine it's coming soon.
Yeah.
What are voters who voted leave in your constituency looking for? Has anxiety about immigration dissipated? What was it ever about?
There is anxiety about immigration. My seat is an interesting case because there is definite desires about immigration. It is very different to almost exclusively white areas because it is, it's 30-40% migrant community or second generation, third generation migrant community where I live. So their fears about immigration don't bubble up in the same way. I get people saying racist things to me on the doorstep. People definitely think that there's been too many people let in, that has somehow affected them. But again, it is every 20th door, not every door that I knock on. So I'm not actually sure that immigration was the single thing in my area. And it's really funny because this is not something that mattered to me particularly at all, and I'll get pilloried for this when you release it, is I actually think the idea of sovereignty mattered to people much more than I had expected.
Wanting decisions closer to home.
Yeah, just thinking we should make our own decisions.
Someone else is bossing us around.
Yeah. It's as simple as that. We should be able to make our decisions. Now, that was hyped up with the stories about, terrorists being able to stay because of their cats that weren't true and all that. So that's how they learnt about us not making our decisions. So it's through a slightly precarious on immigration lens.
Gosh, they won't like Norway Plus, will they? But we can come back to that.
But you say that, though. I did a survey just after Brexit to everyone in my constituency, a direct mail through their door. We had thousands and thousands of responses. And I said, which of these would you prioritise? And that's when I found out that sovereignty really, really mattered to people. But actually, they would prioritise, the single thing that they would prioritise was staying in the single market. There were two options: staying in the single market with immigration controls and staying in the single market no matter what. And actually, the collective group of people who prioritised staying in the single market was huge.
Bigger than all the others.
Huge.
An indicative poll.
Obviously it's self-selecting and all of that. I'm not going to claim to be YouGov or whatever it is.
Do you think that those same people and you can tick me off if you think this is patronising, but I think we've all been on a learning curve, knew what the single market was when they voted the first time. Were as clear about it.
Not in those terms.
They got clearer about it since.
I think they definitely have got clearer about it since. They wouldn't have called it the single market. They wouldn't have called it the customs union. They knew that they could move in between countries. They knew that they worked in Jaguar Land Rover, for example, and they knew that half their parts came from Germany, and then that they sold into markets elsewhere on deals that were done. I don't think they realised actually how many of the deals were done by Europe before. So actually it was after the referendum that the idea of the single market became something in the minds of the people where I live. And they don't, people very rarely talk to me about the single market and the customs union, but they do talk to me about, how we're going to be able to get the stuff from, they do talk about the car factories, they do talk about their kids moving abroad, they do talk about customs union and single market in their own terms.
What do you think people wanted on immigration policy? What are they likely to get?
It is very interesting, and my constituency is in so many ways so different, and yet it's not totally different, in that it's an area that was quite strongly Leave. So I represent an area of southwest Lincolnshire, Grantham and Stamford. They've had not very much non-EU immigration over the years. It is a relatively homogeneous racially, to put it bluntly, but they've had a huge amount of immigration from Eastern Europe. Some of it seasonal, but much of it not, and that's partly because it's a very strong area of agriculture and of growing vegetables, and then there's a lot of food processing, and there's no question that there was a high level of concern about immigration. But I think it was a strange meld of their own direct experience, which was Eastern European, was driven by work, and they all recognised, and people were very able to say so, that these people were coming to take jobs that British people weren't taking. But what it melded with was this sense that in other places, Nottingham, London, Birmingham, there was a huge amount of other kind of immigration from outside the EU. And, you can't expect people necessarily to work out when they're offered a vote in a referendum whether that precise vote will affect this kind of immigration in that place for this reason and not affect this kind of immigration in this place for the other reason.
That's definitely true.
They just were, in general, expressing a concern at the speed of change, the pace of change.
And the lack of control.
Lack of control, and also the lack of support for those areas which had to put up is the wrong word, that had to accept a great number of people moving in. Now, it has changed. There's no question in my mind this has changed. True. It's changed for two big reasons, one of which is what Jess was saying about people's understanding of the single market or the economic arrangements of EU membership. Similarly, I think people have now understood much better what different kinds of immigration there are, which ones would and wouldn't be controlled, but also they've understood critically what immigrants are doing that are of vital importance in keeping society and the economy going. So I find that people are much more ready to talk about care workers in care homes, to talk about doctors and nurses in hospital. My own local A&E has been temporarily closed now for 2 years because they can't recruit enough doctors and nurses. So there's firstly a much greater recognition for the need we have for many of these immigrants. But secondly, bluntly, the numbers have come down from Europe very fast. So we're no longer in a situation as we were in the mid-noughties, the sort of 2004, 5, 6, when you'd had the accession of those Eastern European countries and when the Blair government didn't impose temporary controls. You literally had 500,000-600,000 people a year moving into the UK because the economies of Eastern Europe were not strong, the wages were very low, and here the economy was strong and wages were high. Because that is no longer the case, I think that the pressure has come off, and polls bear it out too.
They do, yeah.
That the salience, the intensity with which people mind about this has slipped a long way down the rankings, and there are now other things they mind about more. And the one argument I make for staying in the EEA, in the sort of common market like Norway, is that yes, you have to accept freedom of movement, but the crucial difference is that you have a legal possibility as a member of the EEA that you do not have as an EU member, and that is an emergency brake. Mm-hmm. I don't know when we could ever exercise it. I don't know how long we could ever exercise it for. I don't know how much difference it would make.
When you could...
Well, no, it's entirely a unilateral judgment. Nobody can review it. There's then a process
make a judgment on it?
No. There's a process that then you have to go through of consulting on what you're proposing to do and whether the reason's justified. If you still insist on doing it, you then are open to them imposing penalties in some form on you for having done so. But just imagine that in 20 years' time, a new country was taken into the European Union, and freedom of movement was going to apply to them. And suddenly you had, again, 500,000 people turning up every year in Dover, wanting to look for work. That's the kind of very rare circumstance in which we would then have something which, if nothing else, would be a negotiating chip with the EU. And we don't have that now. And I believe, maybe I'm being naive, but I believe that with the current state of understanding about immigration, that might just be enough for people to be able to live with free movement continuing.
Also, we need to build a bridge at the moment. The trouble with the UK is we're doing this we're out of time, and actually Europe is about to change with regards to the freedom of movement issue. There is so much changing in mainland Europe around how strict things have to be on this issue, and people like me who grew up in a city of migrants, my migrants in my own family, refugees in my own family. My father is from Ireland. We are a nation of migrants, really. I find it very hard to say this, but it is the case that actually we need to build a bridge to about a year's time when I think these conversations in the European Union will have taken a different tone, not necessarily one that I might like, but I think that Europe on a whole scale, because of the refugee crisis, will be taking different views about how persistent they are about that freedom.
Yeah.
On that point, thank you both very much indeed for coming in. Have a great Christmas when you get there.
Thank you.
I'm sure next week will be quiet, peaceful, and full of goodwill.
I think it's Labour's turn to have a proper old row. Okay, can we take the week off?
You could serve one up at short notice, couldn't you?
I'm sure we can come up with something.
Thank you both.